And then, the veteran stood up. No one had expected it. His sudden movement sent a ripple of unease through the room. He wasn't just standing to make a point, he was standing to make a declaration. His eyes scanned the courtroom, meeting the gaze of every individual present, every individual who had judged him without knowing him, who had decided his fate without understanding his story. The courtroom door creaked open, and a ripple of whispers spread through the room. The veteran didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked straight ahead, and as his eyes met the judge's, he spoke again, his words heavy, carrying years of burden. It wasn't supposed to end like this. You have no idea what they did to me. There was a sudden shift in the air, like a storm on the horizon. The courtroom gasped, unsure if they had heard him correctly. What they did to him? The words hung in the air, pregnant with mystery and confusion. Who was he talking about? What was he referring to? The tension in the room thickened. The judge's hand tightened around the gavel, ready to call the veteran to order, but before anyone could react, the veteran's next words struck like lightning. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was supposed to be someone. The weight of his confession hung in the air like a cloud. For the first time in years, the veteran's voice trembled, and for the first time, those who had come to watch saw him, really saw him, not just a homeless man, not just a veteran lost to the streets. This was a man who had a past, a history, a life that had been stolen from him. The judge cleared his throat, the only sound breaking the sudden quiet. The prosecutor was on his feet now, but the words were stuck in his throat. He had no response, no argument to refute the sheer humanity in the veteran's voice. No one did. The defense attorney glanced nervously at his client, but the veteran's gaze never wavered. He was no longer speaking to anyone in particular. His words were directed outward, as though he was speaking to the world itself. His gaze seemed far away, as though he was reliving moments that none of them could ever understand. The room was paralyzed, caught in a moment of revelation. The veteran took a deep breath, as if gathering all the strength he had left. I fought for this country, he said, his voice steady now, but tinged with years of pain. I gave my body, my soul, and this is what I get in return? The courtroom held its breath, unsure how to respond to this flood of emotion. There was no clear path forward. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, now seemed lost, as if his words no longer held any weight. The defense attorney had nothing to add, his own understanding of the veteran's past far from complete. And the judge was speechless. For a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. The courtroom was suspended in this strange, pregnant silence. The veteran's eyes flickered with something more than sadness, there was anger there, too. But it wasn't just anger at the system. It was anger at something deeper, something that went beyond this courtroom, beyond the law, beyond even the war he had fought in. And with that, the trial took a turn no one could have predicted. The courtroom remained suspended in that uneasy silence. All eyes were on the veteran, who had just dropped a bombshell that left the entire room stunned. The judge sat frozen at his bench, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected outburst. The prosecutor, trying to regain his composure, adjusted his glasses, shuffled his papers, and attempted to speak, but his words were stuck. The defense attorney took a cautious step forward, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He glanced at his client, unsure of what to do next. The veteran stood unmoved, his chest heaving with each shallow breath, his eyes cast downward, as if searching for something inside himself. The judge, still maintaining his professional demeanor despite the shocking turn of events, cleared his throat. Mr. Daniels, he addressed the veteran by his courtroom name, his voice calm but firm. You've made a rather startling statement. I suggest you remain seated and allow your attorney to proceed. But the veteran didn't move. His gaze remained locked on the judge, as if he were searching for some understanding in the man's eyes. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some of them leaning forward in their seats, eager to hear more of what the veteran had to say, others unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. After what seemed like an eternity, the defense attorney stepped in. "Your Honor, I request that my client be given the opportunity to speak freely. We are all here to seek justice, and Mr. Daniels has a story that deserves to be heard." The judge paused for a moment, his stern expression softening just slightly. "Proceed, Mr. Jennings," he said, giving his permission, though the look in his eyes suggested he still wasn't fully convinced of the direction this trial was taking. The veteran's attorney motioned for him to sit, but again, the veteran stood. "I didn't come here to beg for sympathy," he began, his voice steady now, though the weight of his words felt even heavier. "I didn't come here to be a victim. But I need you all to understand. I didn't choose this life. I didn't choose to end up here." The veteran's voice had a rawness to it, one that no lawyer could manufacture, no words could prepare for. The courtroom hung on each word, each breath he took. The defense attorney stood beside him, hesitant to interrupt but knowing this moment was crucial. The prosecutor, now collecting himself, stood to object. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We are here to discuss the charges against this man. His past, his choices, his choices." The veteran interrupted, his voice rising just slightly, but carrying more weight than anyone could have expected. "You want to talk about choices? How many of you have had to choose between hunger and survival? How many of you have had to choose between dignity and humiliation?" The prosecutor flinched, taken aback by the veteran's sudden confrontation. The defense attorney stepped in, his voice steady, though tinged with urgency. "Mr. Daniels, please, let's stay focused." But it was too late. The veteran had already opened the floodgates, and now, the flood of memories and emotions began pouring out. "You want to talk about choices," he continued, his voice now trembling with emotion. "I fought in a war for this country. I bled for it. I came home and watched as everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for, slipped through my fingers like sand. I came home to nothing but empty promises." His words, raw and filled with pain, echoed through the courtroom. The audience was silent, not sure whether to react or listen, but the tension in the room was palpable. The veteran's words were unraveling the carefully constructed case the prosecutor had built. The truth he spoke had the power to shift the balance of everything. "Do you know what it's like to lose everything?" The veteran's voice cracked, his gaze never leaving the prosecutor's face. "Do you know what it's like to be forgotten, to be discarded like yesterday's trash?" The room was still. No one spoke. No one moved. The prosecutor, unable to form a coherent response, stammered. This has no place in this trial. We're not here for a history lesson." The veteran's lips tightened into a thin line, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're here because you've judged me, accused me, and decided that my life is worth nothing. But I'm here to tell you it's not." For a moment, it seemed like the very air in the courtroom had thickened, as if the truth he spoke had a weight of its own, making it hard to breathe. The judge, who had been quietly observing, finally broke the silence. "Enough," he said, his voice commanding, though there was a slight tremor in it now. "Mr. Daniels, I understand you feel strongly about your past, but we are here to address the charges at hand. Please, allow the legal process to run its course." But the veteran wasn't done. He wasn't about to let them sweep his story under the rug. "You don't understand," he said, his words measured but heavy with the years of injustice he had lived through. "You think this trial is about a man who ended up on the streets because of his own failure. But that's not the whole truth. There's more here, more you don't know." The courtroom was frozen, and the veteran's words echoed in the stillness. His voice was calm now, but his eyes revealed something deeper, something that had been buried for far too long. He wasn't just a homeless man. He wasn't just a veteran. He was a man with a story that had been ignored for too long. The defense attorney looked toward the judge, hoping for some kind of order. The prosecutor was now visibly rattled, unsure of how to respond to the veteran's impassioned words. Everyone in the room felt it, the shift, the change in the atmosphere, the undeniable pull of the veteran's truth. And so, the battle continued. But this time, it wasn't just a case. It wasn't just a trial. It was something more. Something bigger. And it was about to change everything. The courtroom was still, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The veteran's words hung in the air, each one weighted with the kind of raw honesty that made it impossible to ignore. For the first time since the trial began, the audience seemed to see him, not just as the man standing trial for his actions, but as someone who had lived a life filled with unimaginable challenges and sacrifices. The veteran had gone silent, his eyes scanning the room as if he were searching for something, perhaps for someone who could understand his pain. The defense attorney, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward. "Your Honor, we've all heard what Mr. Daniels has shared, and while it may not pertain directly to the charges, it's crucial that we understand the full context of his life," the attorney began, his voice steady but firm. "This man, this veteran, has lived a life of hardship that most of us can never imagine." The judge nodded, though his expression was still unreadable. He didn't interrupt, allowing the defense attorney to continue. "Before he was the man you see before you today, Mr. Daniels was a soldier. A soldier who fought for his country. A soldier who gave everything he had, and in return, he was abandoned. Forgotten," the defense attorney continued. "The trauma he experienced, the struggles he faced once he returned home, none of this is something that can be fixed overnight. But it is something that demands attention, something that cannot be swept aside." The prosecutor, now visibly agitated, stood up. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant," he exclaimed. "This trial is not about the past. It is about a man who has broken the law, who has been living on the streets, who has committed a crime. We cannot allow him to distract us with stories of his former life." But the defense attorney wasn't finished. "This trial is precisely about his life, Mr. Wood. It's about understanding why he ended up where he did, and how we, as a society, failed him. We cannot just look at the actions of a man and ignore the environment that created them." The prosecutor tried to respond, but his words faltered. The defense's argument had struck a nerve, and now the courtroom was divided. The tension was thick, as if everyone could feel the underlying truth in what was being said. It wasn't just about the man standing before them, it was about the system, the society, and the way they had failed not just this veteran, but countless others like him. The judge, sensing the rising emotions, raised his hand for silence. The room immediately fell still once again. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said, his voice softer now, though it still carried authority. "You've shared your struggles, your hardships. And while we must address the charges before us, your testimony has brought something to light that cannot be ignored." The veteran's eyes shifted toward the judge, his expression guarded but hopeful. He had no idea where this trial would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt like someone was finally listening to him. "I understand," the judge continued, "that the circumstances of your life may have influenced your actions. And while we must remain focused on the law, I want to make it clear that your story will not be disregarded." The veteran nodded silently, his gaze lowering as though the weight of the judge's words were too much to bear. It wasn't a victory, but it was a small, fragile moment of acknowledgement that he hadn't received in years. He wasn't invisible anymore. But as the trial continued, the focus shifted back to the heart of the case, the events that had led him to this point. The prosecutor, though shaken by the veteran's testimony, refocused his efforts. His voice grew sharp as he began detailing the charges against the veteran once more. "You say you didn't ask for this life," the prosecutor said, his tone now dripping with accusation. "But your actions have consequences. Your decision to commit this crime, your failure to abide by the laws of this country you claim to have fought for, it speaks for itself." The veteran's eyes hardened as the prosecutor continued. There was no mistaking the bitterness that had settled into his bones over the years. He had fought for a country that had promised him much, only to deliver little in return. He had given everything, and yet he had been left to pick up the pieces alone. But the words of the prosecutor, as harsh as they were, didn't shake him. He knew he couldn't change the past, couldn't erase the things he'd done in the heat of his desperation. What mattered now was making sure that his story was heard, truly heard. He couldn't undo the years he had spent as a homeless veteran, but he could make sure that no one else would have to suffer the same fate. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the veteran stood tall once again, though his body was tired and worn. He was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The trial had become more than just a legal battle, it had become a battle for his humanity. For the first time, he felt like he was being seen for who he truly was, not just a criminal, but a man who had lived through more than most people could ever imagine. The judge called for a recess, and the courtroom began to empty. The veteran's attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a comforting squeeze. "You did good today," he said softly. But the veteran didn't respond. He was lost in thought, his mind racing through the events of the day. The trial wasn't over yet, and he didn't know what the outcome would be. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of being judged. He wasn't afraid of being forgotten. He had told his truth, and no matter what happened next, that was enough. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind the veteran as the recess began. The air outside was a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere inside, where the weight of the trial seemed to follow every step he took. As he walked down the narrow hallway, his mind churned with the events of the day, each word, each accusation, each moment that had led him to this place. But then something unexpected happened. A woman, someone he hadn't seen in years, stepped out from behind a pillar and approached him. She looked just as weathered as he felt, but there was something familiar in her face, a look that immediately drew him back to a time when life hadn't been so harsh. "Mr. Daniels, I need to speak with you," she said, her voice soft yet urgent. The veteran stopped in his tracks, his mind still grappling with the courtroom's chaos. He blinked, not recognizing her at first, but then a memory surfaced, though faint and distant. "Who are you?" "I was there," she said, her eyes filled with an emotion that took him by surprise, regret. "I was there when it happened. When you went through hell, I watched you." His chest tightened. "You're mistaken. I don't remember you." The woman looked down at the floor, gathering herself before continuing. "I was there when you came back from the war. I saw you, broken, but still trying to stand. I wanted to help you, but I didn't know how." Her voice faltered, and for the first time, the veteran saw the tears in her eyes. "I couldn't help you, but I should have." The veteran stood motionless, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't a stranger, she was a face from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years, but who had witnessed the same painful journey he had. He had been so consumed by his own suffering that he had never considered how it might have affected the people around him. "Why are you here?" he finally asked, his voice low, filled with confusion and suspicion. "I've been following your case," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard about what happened to you, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. I need to tell the court what I know, Mr. Daniels. I need them to hear the truth of what you went through, what really happened after you came home. The truth of how they failed you." The veteran stared at her, disbelief and curiosity flickering in his eyes. She wasn't just anyone, she was someone who had been a part of his life, someone who had seen his darkest days. She had seen him when he was vulnerable, when he was lost, and now, she wanted to speak out on his behalf. "You want to help me?" he asked, his voice guarded but with a trace of hope. "I can't change what's been done," she said softly, her voice steadying. But I can make sure that the people who did this to you don't get away with it." The veteran's heart skipped a beat. Could he really trust her? Could he trust anyone after everything that had happened? Before he could respond, she placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of solidarity. "I've lived with the guilt of not speaking up sooner, Mr. Daniels. But today, I'm making things right. The truth needs to be heard." The veteran's gaze softened as he looked into her eyes. It was as if the years of bitterness, the distrust that had built up around him like a fortress, began to crumble. He had been fighting alone for so long, and yet here was someone who had once been on the outside, someone who could have turned away but chose not to. She was offering him something he hadn't known he needed, a chance to be seen as more than just the man in the courtroom, more than just the veteran who had fallen through the cracks. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next day, when the trial reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The veteran sat at the defendant's table, his back straight, his gaze focused, but this time, there was something else in his eyes: determination. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the woman from the hallway stepped inside, her presence commanding attention. She walked to the witness stand without hesitation, and for the first time in the trial, the courtroom fell completely silent. Her testimony was nothing short of explosive. She recounted the time she had spent with the veteran when he returned from the war, how the system had failed him at every turn, how he had been denied the care he desperately needed. She spoke of the days when he had been discharged and left to fend for himself, ignored by those who should have been his support. She described in vivid detail the way the veteran's struggles were dismissed, his pain unacknowledged by the very system that had sent him into war. "I watched him change," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with the conviction of someone who had lived through the pain. "He went from being a proud soldier to someone who was forgotten by the very country he fought for. I saw him suffer. I saw him lose everything." Each word she spoke sent a ripple through the courtroom. The prosecutor, once so sure of his case, sat back, visibly unsettled by the strength of her testimony. The judge, too, seemed taken aback, his gaze flicking between the woman on the stand and the veteran seated across from her. Her testimony painted a picture of a man who had been wronged by more than just the circumstances of his life. It was a system that had abandoned him, a country that had failed to live up to the promises made to its soldiers. And now, for the first time, the truth was coming to light. By the time she finished, the courtroom was a different place. The veteran was no longer just a defendant, he was a symbol of every man and woman who had returned from war, only to be left to fight battles no one else could see. And for the first time, his story had been told, and it was no longer just his burden to carry. The prosecutor sat motionless, unable to counter the impact of the truth. The defense attorney, now emboldened by the unexpected ally, stood a little taller. The veteran, though exhausted, felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, as though the years of struggle, of silence, had finally been heard. The trial was far from over, but it had already become something more than just a legal case. It had become a battle for justice, not just for one man, but for all the veterans who had been forgotten. And for the first time in years, the veteran could finally see the path ahead. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the recess began. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the shock of the testimony, and now the very air felt charged, as though the tides of the trial were about to turn. The veteran, sitting at the defense table, glanced around the room. His heart pounded in his chest, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The woman's testimony had shaken the foundations of the prosecution's case. It had given him a voice that could no longer be ignored. For the first time in the trial, the veteran felt seen. His past, his struggles, and the injustice he had faced were no longer buried in silence. They were out in the open for everyone to see, and now, it was clear that the fight had only just begun. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. They seemed less certain, their expressions filled with doubt. The prosecutor, who had once been so confident, appeared unsettled, as though the weight of the woman's testimony had hit him harder than he expected. The veteran straightened in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had no idea how this trial would end, but he was no longer just a pawn in a system that had treated him like nothing. He was a man with a story, and now, people were listening. The judge called the room to order, and the trial resumed. The prosecutor, flustered but determined to regain control, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we've heard an emotional testimony from the defendant's ally," the prosecutor said, his voice tight. "But emotional appeals do not change the facts of the case. Mr. Daniels is still charged with a crime, and we must not lose sight of that fact." His words, though firm, didn't carry the same conviction they had earlier. The shift in the room was undeniable. The judge glanced at the veteran, then at the prosecutor, and nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Wood," he said, allowing the prosecutor to continue. But the veteran knew something had changed. The prosecutor's stance had softened. The courtroom no longer saw him as just the man on trial. He was more than that, he had become a symbol of the broader issue, a man whose story mirrored that of countless other veterans who had fallen through the cracks of a broken system. The defense attorney stood, and the veteran braced himself for what came next. His lawyer had been building a strong case, one that hadn't yet fully been heard. Today, they had made progress. But it wasn't over. "Your Honor, we've heard the prosecution's argument," the defense attorney said, his voice clear and unwavering. "But we must ask, what is the true cost of a system that fails to care for those who've served it? What is the true cost of a country that promises protection, only to abandon its heroes when they return home?" His words echoed through the courtroom, and the veteran felt a surge of emotion. It was as though the walls had come down, the facade of the trial stripped away, and now, the real issue, how society treated its veterans, was in full view. "We're not here to ignore the defendant's actions," the defense continued. "But we are here to ask whether those actions were the result of a broken system, one that pushed this man, this hero, to the very edge of survival. If we fail to recognize that, then we're condemning not just Mr. Daniels, but every man and woman who has ever served this country and been left behind." The prosecutor stood, visibly rattled but trying to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, this is a criminal case, not a political one. The defendant's actions were wrong, regardless of his circumstances." But the words rang hollow. The courtroom had changed. The judge looked at the veteran with a new understanding, as though the weight of his testimony, his past, had finally reached the ears that mattered. The audience in the gallery murmured amongst themselves. For the first time, the veteran wasn't just an outcast, he was a voice for a greater cause. The judge raised his hand, calling the room to silence once more. "We will recess for the day," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something more, perhaps even a touch of empathy that hadn't been present before. "The court will reconvene tomorrow to hear closing statements." As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, the veteran stood slowly, his legs stiff from hours of sitting. His attorney gave him an encouraging nod, but the veteran's thoughts were far away. He wasn't thinking about the verdict. He was thinking about the moment the truth had come to light, the moment the system had been exposed for what it truly was. The veteran left the courtroom, his heart heavy but filled with a sense of purpose. For the first time, he knew that the truth was on his side. It wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to face the same fate he had. He was ready for whatever came next. But no matter the outcome of this trial, one thing was certain, his voice had been heard. And that, in itself, was a victory. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. People had come from all over, drawn not just by the trial itself, but by the weight of the story it carried. The judge had made it clear that this case was about more than just the defendant, it was about the very systems that governed the lives of those who had served this country. The veteran sat at the defense table, his gaze fixed ahead. He wasn't nervous, he was resolved. He had already done what he set out to do. Now, all he could do was wait and see if the truth would win the day. The prosecutor stood first, preparing his closing arguments. His voice was stronger now, but it lacked the force it once had. The weight of the defense's case had taken its toll. He spoke of justice, of accountability, but his words felt empty, as though he was merely going through the motions. When the defense attorney rose to speak, the room fell silent. The veteran's lawyer didn't speak of justice in the same way the prosecutor had. He spoke of humanity. He spoke of a man who had been betrayed by the very system he had fought for, of a man who deserved a second chance, not just for his crime, but for the life he had been robbed of. As the closing statements wrapped up, the jury was left to deliberate. It was now up to them to decide the fate of a man who had been broken by the system, but who had fought harder than anyone could ever imagine to have his voice heard. The veteran sat quietly, waiting for the verdict. But in his heart, he knew one thing for certain, he had already won. The days following the trial were filled with tension. The veteran's story had reverberated through the courtroom, leaving a mark on everyone who had witnessed it. But while the world seemed to stand still, waiting for the final verdict, the veteran's mind remained restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked beneath the surface of his case. Something more sinister, more personal than the crime he had been accused of. It wasn't until a few days later, when his attorney sat him down in the small, dimly lit office, that the truth began to unfold. The lawyer, normally calm and collected, looked unusually tense as he shut the door behind him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Daniels," he began, "I've been digging into the history of your case, and I've come across something that might change everything." The veteran leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, cautious. "The trial itself, the case against you, it's not just about your actions. It's about the people who allowed this to happen. People who knowingly left you to suffer." The attorney paused, as if weighing the gravity of his next words. "The prosecutor, Mr. Wood, he's not just doing his job. He has a deeper connection to your story than you realize." The veteran's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" The lawyer slid a thick file across the desk. "This is the background of the prosecutor, his family, his history. And buried in these records is something shocking." The veteran took the file and flipped through the papers. As he read, the pieces began to fall into place. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The prosecutor's father, a high-ranking official in the Department of Veterans Affairs, had been directly involved in the very system that had failed the veteran and countless others like him. The same system that had turned its back on him when he needed it most. This can't be real," the veteran muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The realization hit him hard, each word in the file like a punch to the gut. They knew. They knew what was happening to us, and they did nothing. The attorney nodded, his face grim. "Not only did they do nothing, but they actively obstructed efforts to help veterans like you. The system was designed to keep people like you in the dark, to sweep your suffering under the rug. And the prosecutor, he's a part of that system. His father was one of the key architects of the policy that led to veterans being abandoned after they returned home." The veteran felt a cold chill run down his spine. He had always known that something wasn't right, but now the truth was staring him in the face. His trial wasn't just about him. It was about a system built on lies, corruption, and a complete disregard for the lives of those who had fought for their country. "But why?" the veteran asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why target me? Why now?" The lawyer sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because your case is a symbol. They knew that if your story got out, if people saw the truth of what happened to you, it would shine a light on everything they've worked so hard to cover up. Your suffering, your fight, is a reminder of the failure of the entire system. And they didn't want that kind of attention. They needed someone to blame, and you became that scapegoat. The veteran leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. For years, he had fought to survive. He had fought to keep his dignity, to maintain a semblance of hope, even when the world seemed to be pushing him further and further into darkness. And now, he learned that the very people who had built the system that destroyed his life were still trying to control the narrative, to twist the truth to their advantage. "I never stood a chance," he whispered bitterly. "You didn't," the lawyer agreed, his voice softening. "But now you do. The truth is coming out. And with it, the people who are truly responsible for your suffering will finally be held accountable." The veteran closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. It wasn't just about his own fate anymore. It was about taking down the system that had failed him, that had failed countless others. It was about showing the world that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions. The next day, the courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and families of veterans. Word had spread quickly about the shocking revelation surrounding the prosecutor's family ties to the corrupt system. The judge had agreed to allow the new evidence to be presented, and for the first time in the trial, it seemed like the veteran might finally have a chance at justice. The veteran entered the courtroom, his head held high. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but this time, it didn't matter. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was no longer a victim, he was a fighter. And today, he would show the world the true face of the system that had torn him apart. As the trial reconvened, the defense attorney stood and presented the new evidence. The room fell silent as the prosecutor's connection to the corrupt system was laid bare for everyone to see. The veteran's face was a mixture of anger and determination as the truth unfolded. He could hear the gasps from the audience, the shock and disbelief as the lies that had been told for years were finally exposed. The prosecutor sat in stunned silence, his face pale, his hands trembling. The judge, though composed, could no longer hide his surprise. He looked at the prosecutor, then at the veteran, as though trying to process everything that had been revealed. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said, his voice steady but firm, "this is not just a case of a man who has been wronged. This is a case of a system that has actively worked to silence those who were brave enough to speak out. Mr. Daniels is not the villain here. The villain is the system that has betrayed him, and so many others." The veteran felt a surge of relief wash over him as the room buzzed with whispers. The prosecutor, once so confident, was now nothing more than a shell of his former self, unable to defend the truth that had been exposed. For the first time, the veteran felt like the battle was no longer just about him, it was about justice for all those who had been left behind, for all the veterans who had been forgotten. And as the trial drew to a close, the veteran knew that no matter what the final verdict was, the real victory had already been won. The truth had come to light, and with it, the hope that change was finally possible. It wasn't just the end of the trial. It was the beginning of a new fight, one that would take on the true enemy, the system that had failed so many. And this time, the veteran would not be silenced.